Some dogs forget commands when they grow old. This one forgot almost everything, except the way back to the man he once swore not to lose. Rain hammered the tin roof of the shelter outside Newcastle hard enough to drown conversation, the kind of cold coastal storm that turned gravel into black sludge and filled the air with the smell of wet rust and eucalyptus bark. Most of the dogs had curled into themselves hours ago, exhausted by the weather, their breathing soft beneath the yellow glow of the emergency lights. But in the final kennel near the back fence, a German shepherd stood perfectly still. Rex, 9 years old, gray around the muzzle, left ear nicked from a deployment nobody at the shelter knew about. His ribs pressed faintly beneath thinning sable fur as thunder rolled over the Pacific like distant artillery. The volunteer on night shift glanced toward him while ticking names from a clipboard. "Poor old bloke," she whispered, still waiting for someone. But Rex was not looking at the gate. He was looking beyond it, beyond the soaked highway, beyond the freight yards and rain-covered servo stations and dim harbor lights trembling in the storm. His amber eyes narrowed suddenly. One breath, then another. Something shifted deep inside him. Not a miracle. A thin trail of storm-bent wind, wet diesel, cedar wood, and old military soap clung to the night. Faint, almost gone. His body stiffened at once. The volunteer barely had time to react before Rex backed away from the kennel door, muscles trembling beneath his soaked coat. "Easy, mate," she murmured softly. Then the shepherd launched forward. The rusted latch cracked against the wire with a sharp metallic snap. Rex pushed through the gap with desperate force, scraping his shoulder against steel as alarms burst alive through the shelter corridor. Rex, boots pounded behind him. Flashlights swung through rain and darkness. But the old K9 never looked back. He tore through puddles and mud with a limp that worsened whenever he pushed too hard, claws slipping over bitumen as freezing rain soaked him to the bone. Cars hissed past along the highway. Neon signs flickered weakly through sheets of water. Somewhere beyond the storm, that scent still existed. And the forgotten dog moved like he had a mission again. Nearly 12 kilometers south, beneath the flickering lights of a near-empty truck stop outside Lake Macquarie, Ethan Calloway sat alone inside a battered white Hilux with fogged windows and a dying heater. The dashboard clock read 2:13 a.m. Empty takeaway cups rolled across the passenger floor every time the wind shook the Utah. His right hand rested against the steering wheel, rough knuckles pale beneath faded tattoos. One of them, hidden partly beneath his jacket sleeve, showed the outline of a German shepherd wearing a military harness. The ink had faded over the years, just like everything else. Ethan stared through the rain toward the servo across the road where fluorescent lights buzzed over wet concrete. His face looked older than 38 tonight. The sharp jawline had softened beneath exhaustion. Stubble darkened his cheeks. A faint scar crossed the bridge of his nose from another lifetime, another country, another where nobody around here cared to remember anymore. He reached into his pocket slowly and pulled out a silver wedding ring wrapped in tissue paper. For a long moment, he just stared at it while rain rattled against the roof above him. "Sorry, Em," he whispered. "I'm trying." The words disappeared into silence. Outside, road trains thundered through the storm toward Sydney, their headlights cutting long white scars across the darkness. Ethan rubbed both hands over his face and leaned back against the seat. He had lost the house 6 months ago, lost his security job 3 weeks after that. Most mates stopped calling not long after the drinking started. Funny how quiet life became when people realized you couldn't save yourself anymore. He closed his eyes, just for a second. Then something moved beyond the windscreen. A shape, low to the ground. Ethan frowned and sat upright slowly as rain streamed down the glass. At first he thought it was a stray roo crossing near the bins. Then lightning flashed over the harbor. And there, standing beneath the pale servo lights with rain dripping from silvered fur, was a German shepherd staring directly at him from across the road. The dog did not bark. That was the first thing Ethan noticed. Most strays hanging around truck stops barked for food or flinched under headlights before vanishing into the dark. But this German shepherd simply stood there in the rain, motionless beneath the servo lights while water streamed from his coat in silver ribbons. One passing road train shook the ground hard enough to rattle the windows of the Hilux. Yet the animal never moved his eyes away from Ethan. Something about that stare tightened deep inside his chest. Familiar, not the dog itself, The feeling, like hearing an old war song through a cracked radio after years of silence. Ethan pushed open the UTA door slowly and stepped into the freezing rain. Wind carried the smell of wet diesel and salt from the harbor less than 3 kilometers away. His boots splashed through shallow puddles as he crossed the empty forecourt. The shepherd took one careful step forward, then stopped again. Older than he first thought. Much older. The dog's sable coat had dulled around the shoulders, and streaks of gray spread heavily across his muzzle. One ear carried a small split near the tip. His chest looked lean beneath soaked fur, not starving, but worn down by years. Ethan crouched slightly, palms open. Easy there, mate. The dog blinked once. Amber eyes. Calm eyes. Military eyes. Ethan felt something shift uncomfortably beneath his ribs. You lost? He asked quietly. The shepherd lowered his head a fraction at the sound of Ethan's voice. Not fear. Recognition. Rain hammered the servo roof above them while neon lights buzzed softly against the storm. Somewhere behind the counter, a radio played an old midnight oil track muffled by static. The dog took another step closer. Slow. Measured. Ethan noticed the posture immediately. The straight spine. The controlled breathing. The way the animal watched hands first before faces. Not pet behavior. Working dog behavior. His stomach tightened. Nah, he whispered to himself. Could not be. The shepherd stopped less than 2 meters away now. Ethan could see an old faded collar hidden beneath thick wet fur. No council tag visible, only cracked black leather worn smooth by time. The dog inhaled once deeply toward Ethan's jacket. Then his entire body went still. Ethan felt the breath leave his lungs. A memory flickered through his mind, so suddenly it almost hurt. Afghan dust storms swallowing the horizon. Rotor blades chopping through dry heat. A younger dog pressing close beside him near a burnt convoy, while distant radio chatter crackled through his headset. Ethan swallowed hard and stepped back instinctively. No. The shepherd tilted his head slightly. The exact same movement. The exact same look. Lightning flashed white across the harbor, and for half a second Ethan saw him clearly. The nicked ear. The broad chest. The scar beneath the left eye nearly hidden by age. Rex. Ethan staggered backward as though the storm itself had struck him. Jesus Christ, his voice cracked. Rex. The dog did not leap forward. Did not bark. He simply walked closer through the rain until he stood directly in front of Ethan beneath the trembling servo lights. Then slowly, carefully, the old K9 lowered himself into a perfect sitting posture. Trained. Disciplined. Waiting. Ethan stared at him in disbelief. 8 years. 8 bloody years. The unit had told him Rex was reassigned after Darwin. Then came transfers, retirements, and records sealed behind offices that never returned calls. Eventually somebody mentioned a private handler in Queensland. After that, nothing. Just silence. Ethan had stopped searching after Emma died. There had not been enough left inside him to keep chasing ghosts. But now one sat directly in front of him, breathing steam into the freezing night air. Ethan dropped to one knee without realizing it. Rain soaked through his jeans instantly. His hands trembled as he reached toward the shepherd's face. Mate, he whispered brokenly. What happened to you? Rex stepped forward the final distance and pressed his nose gently against Ethan's right forearm, directly over the faded tattoo of the military dog. Ethan shut his eyes hard. That touch shattered something inside him. Not loudly, quietly, like ice cracking across deep water. He bowed his head against Rex's neck while rain poured over both of them. The dog's fur smelled of wet earth, old timber, and the faint sterile scent shelters never fully washed away. But beneath all of it lingered another smell Ethan remembered instantly. Burnt cordite, desert dust, loyalty. Rex leaned his weight against him with a tired exhale, and suddenly Ethan was no longer standing outside a servo at 2 in the morning. He was 29 again, crouched beside an armored vehicle in Kandahar province, while Rex barked sharply toward a collapsed roadside barrier nobody else had noticed. 20 seconds later, engineers found the hidden explosives. 20 seconds. The difference between breathing and a folded flag. Ethan opened his eyes slowly. You stubborn old bastard, he murmured, voice rough with emotion. Rex's tail moved once against the wet concrete. Just once. Behind them, the servo attendant stepped outside carrying a broom, then froze mid-step staring at the scene beneath the lights. Mate, the young bloke called softly. That your dog? Ethan looked at Rex for a long moment before answering. The shepherd never took his eyes off him, like he had spent years surviving just long enough to reach this exact moment. Ethan swallowed hard. Yeah, he whispered finally. Yeah, I think he is. Wind swept across the forecourt harder now, carrying colder rain from the coast. Rex shifted closer against Ethan's side without hesitation, as though the years between them had never existed at all. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Calloway no longer felt completely alone. The rain eased slightly by the time Ethan opened the passenger door of the Hilux, but the cold had deepened into the kind that crawled into old injuries and stayed there. Rex hesitated beside the Udo for the first time that night. His amber eyes studied the vehicle carefully, nose twitching against the damp wind blowing off Lake Macquarie. Ethan recognized the behavior instantly. Clearance check. Habit drilled into military dogs after years around explosives and unstable roads. Even now, old instincts still lived beneath the gray fur and tired bones. Ethan swallowed against the lump tightening his throat. Still doing your job? He murmured. Softly. Rex circled the Udo once, slow but deliberate, claws clicking faintly against wet asphalt before finally climbing inside. The old shepherd settled heavily onto the passenger seat with a long, exhausted breath, water dripping from his coat onto takeaway wrappers and faded work gloves scattered across the floor. For a moment, neither of them moved. The servo lights hummed outside while rain ticked gently across the windscreen. Ethan glanced sideways at the dog beside him and still struggled to believe what he was seeing. 8 years disappeared and remained all at once. Rex looked older now, thinner. There were streaks of white along his chest Ethan did not remember, and the scar beneath his eye had deepened with age. But the presence remained exactly the same. Calm, watchful, loyal beyond reason. Ethan turned the heater on full blast, though it barely pushed warm air anymore. Rex lifted his nose toward the vent with tired appreciation before lowering his head slowly against the seat. The movement revealed something beneath his collar. A metal tag. Ethan froze. His hands shook slightly as he reached toward it. Rex allowed it without hesitation. The tag was old military issue, scratched almost smooth with time. But one line remained readable beneath the faded numbers. Rex K9 Unit 7. Ethan stared at the engraving while distant thunder rolled across the harbor. Unit 7. Kandahar. His chest tightened painfully. Bloody hell, he whispered. Memories returned in fragments now. Sunburnt dust swirling beneath helicopters. The smell of diesel and sweat trapped inside armored vehicles. Young soldiers laughing too loudly because silence made men think too much. And always Rex nearby, ears alert, amber eyes scanning every shadow before Ethan even noticed danger existed. Back then, Ethan had trusted the dog more than he trusted himself, sometimes more than command. He remembered one night especially. Winter deployment. Temperature near 3 degrees. A narrow dirt road winding through black hills under moonlight. Rex suddenly stopped walking beside the convoy and refused to move forward. No barking. No panic. Just complete refusal. Some officers grew frustrated. One even ordered another handler forward. But Ethan saw it in the dog's body immediately. Tension. Certainty. Fear held under discipline. 20 meters ahead, engineers discovered unstable ground hiding buried explosives beneath loose rock. Ethan never forgot the silence afterward. Men standing in cold desert air staring at Rex like the dog had reached into the future and dragged them back alive. A soft sound pulled Ethan from the memory. Rex was dreaming. Small movements twitched through his paws while quiet breaths fogged the cold window beside him. Ethan watched carefully. Even asleep, the old shepherd positioned himself toward Ethan rather than away. Protective. Always protective. The heater rattled weakly. Outside, the storm drifted north toward Newcastle, leaving behind slick roads glistening beneath streetlights. Ethan rubbed tired hands over his face and realized something strange. For the first time in months, maybe years, the crushing pressure inside his chest had eased slightly. Not gone, just quieter. Like grief itself had stepped outside for air. He looked down at the wedding ring still resting in his palm. Emma used to say Rex understood emotions better than most people. She had loved the dog from the beginning, despite the military training and intimidating size. On difficult nights after Ethan returned from deployment, Rex would leave his own bed and lie beside the front door until Ethan finally slept. Emma called him their silent guardian. Ethan shut his eyes briefly. God, he missed her. Cancer had taken everything slowly. The house, the savings, the future they planned near Port Stevens with a small repair shop and a fishing boat neither could afford yet. After she died, Ethan stopped answering calls, stopped shaving regularly, stopped caring whether mornings arrived at all. The military pension barely covered fuel and cheap meals now. Some weeks the Hilux felt less like transport and more like the final place life had left him. Yet somehow this old dog had found him again through kilometers of coastline, rain, and passing strangers. Ethan glanced at Rex once more. How did you even know where I was? He whispered. Rex opened one eye slowly at the sound of his voice. Then, with the quiet certainty only dogs possess, he rested his head gently against Ethan's arm, the exact same way he used to after patrols overseas. Ethan felt his throat tighten again. A bitter laugh escaped him softly. You tracked me down just to make sure I was not dead yet. Rex's tail thumped once against the seat. Outside the servo, dawn remained hours away. Most of the world still slept behind locked doors and warm blankets while road trains drifted through rain toward distant cities. But inside the battered white Hilux, something long broken had begun shifting back into place. Ethan reached behind the seat for the last unopened meat pie wrapped in paper from earlier that day. He split it carefully in half and handed one piece to Rex. The old shepherd accepted it gently from his hand, just as trained military dogs were taught years ago. No snapping, no greed, pure trust. Ethan smiled faintly for the first time in months. A real smile this time. Small, fragile, but real. Then his eyes drifted toward the highway beyond the rain-streaked glass, where dark pine hills disappeared into the distance. Somewhere out there waited another lonely morning, another unpaid bill, another uncertain week. But tonight, for the first time in years, the road ahead no longer looked completely empty. Morning arrived quietly over Lake Macquarie, pale silver lights spilling across wet bitumen and drifting fog, as if the storm itself had finally grown tired. Ethan woke stiff inside the Hilux with his neck aching against the window and cold air fogging every breath. For one confused second he forgot where he was. Then he felt warmth pressed against his side. Rex. The old shepherd still slept curled against the passenger seat, one paw resting lightly near Ethan's arm like he needed physical proof the man had not disappeared overnight. Dawn softened the years on the dog's face. The gray fur around his muzzle looked almost white now beneath the weak morning light, and fresh scratches lined one shoulder from forcing his way through the shelter fence. Ethan stared at him quietly. 8 years lost. 8 years somehow survived. Outside, gulls cried somewhere near the marina, while the first trod eyes of the morning shuffled into the servo for coffee and fuel. Life continuing like normal. Ethan rubbed his eyes and stepped out of the Utah, stretching sore muscles beneath a sky still heavy with leftover rain clouds. The cold carried that sharp coastal smell unique to New South Wales after storms. Salt, wet timber, petrol, the sort of morning Emma used to love. He swallowed hard at the thought and walked toward the servo entrance, while Rex followed close beside him without command. The young attendant from earlier glanced up from stacking pies behind the warmer and broke into a grin. There he is, he said softly, nodding toward Rex. Thought the old fellow might vanish before daylight. Ethan managed a faint smile. So did I. The bloke crouched slightly behind the counter. He yours for real? Ethan hesitated. Strange question. Hard question. Rex had once belonged to the military. Then paperwork. Then handlers. Then years lost somewhere between shelters and forgotten records. But standing here now with the dog calmly pressed against his leg, none of that seemed to matter anymore. Yeah, Ethan answered quietly. Always was. The attendant handed over 2 bacon rolls wrapped in paper and a small bowl of water without charging him. For your mate, he said. Ethan looked surprised. I cannot pay for that. Did not ask you to. The young bloke shrugged awkwardly. My old man served too. Dogs like that, they do not stop showing up unless it means something. Ethan nodded once, unable to speak for a moment. Outside, Rex drank slowly from the bowl while morning traffic thickened along the highway. Ethan leaned against the Hilux watching the dog carefully. Even resting, Rex remained alert to everything around them. Passing engines. Sudden footsteps. A motorbike revving too hard near the intersection. Military conditioning buried so deep it had become instinct rather than training. Ethan remembered long nights overseas when Rex would wake before incoming helicopters appeared on the horizon. Some soldiers joked the dog could smell danger itself. Others stopped joking after enough patrols came home safely because Rex refused to ignore something. Humans missed. Ethan looked down at the shepherd now and noticed a stiffness in his back leg. Subtle, easy to miss, but there. Age catching up. Come on, mate, he murmured. Let us get you looked at. The veterinary clinic sat 8 kilometers inland near Belmont, tucked beside a bakery and fishing supply shop beneath faded gum trees dripping rainwater onto parked cars. Ethan almost turned around twice before arriving. Money sat dangerously low in his account already. He still owed registration on the Hilux. Fuel prices kept climbing. An old military pride made asking for help feel heavier than carrying it alone. But one glance at Rex limping slightly beside him settled the matter. The clinic smelled of antiseptic and wet dogs the moment they stepped inside. A woman at reception looked up from her computer and softened immediately at the sight of Rex. "Oh, darling," she whispered. "He is beautiful." Rex remained close against Ethan's leg while another nurse approached slowly with careful hands. "What is his name?" Ethan answered automatically. "Rex." The name still felt strange in his mouth after so many silent years. The nurse smiled gently. "He looks tired." Ethan glanced down at the dog. "Yeah," he said quietly. "So do I." An hour later, a veterinarian named Hannah Morgan sat across from Ethan, holding X-rays against the clinic light while rain tapped softly against the windows again. She looked to be in her early 40s with tired blue eyes and freckles across her nose. Kind eyes. The sort that had probably delivered both miracles and heartbreak inside these walls. "He has advanced arthritis in the hips," she explained softly. "Quite advanced. Some scar tissue along the shoulder too. Old working injuries by the look of it." Ethan stroked Rex's neck absent-mindedly while listening. The shepherd rested calmly beside his chair, as though simply being near Ethan had settled something restless inside him. Hannah continued carefully. "For a dog his age and history, he is holding up remarkably well. But he has been through a lot." Ethan looked down at the faded military tag resting against Rex's chest. "I should have found him sooner." Hannah studied him for a long second. "Maybe," she said gently. "But he still found you." Silence settled between them. Outside, wind stirred rainwater through the gum trees lining the car park. Ethan stared at Rex while guilt pressed heavily into his chest. During the darkest years after Emma died, he had stopped searching for almost everything. Friends, purpose, himself. Somewhere along the way, he convinced himself losing Rex was simply another wound life expected him to carry quietly. Yet this old dog had crossed a storm, dangerous roads, and years of neglect just to sit beside him again. Ethan swallowed hard. Can dogs really recognize someone after that long? Hannah smiled faintly. "Not just someone," she answered. "Their person, scent, voice, routine, it all comes back." Rex lifted his head at Ethan's voice the moment he spoke again, eyes calm and unwavering despite age and exhaustion. Ethan felt something ache deep beneath his ribs. Loyalty like this did not belong to ordinary life. It belonged to something gentler, older, almost sacred. Later that afternoon, the rain finally broke apart completely, revealing pale sunlight over the lake as Ethan drove north along the coastline with Rex asleep beside him. The world outside the Hilux seemed different somehow. Fishermen stood along the jetty's untangling lines. Children in school uniforms hurried across crossings. Cafes reopened their outdoor chairs still damp from the storm. Small, ordinary moments. Life continuing. Ethan rested one hand lightly against Rex's shoulder while driving. The old shepherd did not wake, but his tail thumped once softly against the seat at the contact. And for the first time in many years, Ethan found himself thinking not about what he had lost, but about what might still be waiting ahead. That night the temperature dropped fast along the coast, the kind of sharp winter cold that crept inland from the Pacific after heavy rain and settled over the highways like a warning. Ethan parked the Hilux near a quiet reserve outside Swansea where gum trees leaned over the lake and old timber picnic shelters creaked softly in the wind. He used to stop here years ago with Emma after late drives north. Back then the world still felt open, possible. Now the paint on the picnic tables had faded and weeds pushed through cracked concrete paths leading toward the water. Funny how places aged while memories stayed painfully young. Rex climbed carefully from the Uta and paused beside the shoreline, nose lifted toward the dark water shimmering beneath moonlight. The old shepherd breathed deeply, ears twitching toward distant sounds only dogs seemed able to separate from silence. Somewhere across the lake a fishing boat engine hummed low against the night. Wind carried the scent of wet reeds and salt through the reserve. Ethan spread an old blanket across the back seat for Rex before sitting on the bonnet with a takeaway coffee warming his hands. For a long while neither of them moved much. Just man and dog resting beneath silver clouds drifting slowly across the stars. Peaceful. Yet underneath that peace Ethan felt something unfamiliar now stirring inside him. Hope frightened people who had spent too long surviving disappointment. He looked toward Rex beside the shoreline and wondered how many nights the old dog had slept alone before finding him again. How many cages? How many strangers? How many roads? Sorry it took me so long, mate. Ethan said quietly into the cold air. Rex turned immediately at the sound of his voice and walked back toward him with that same calm military focus. No hesitation. No resentment. Just trust. The shepherd settled beside the hylix while Ethan rubbed one hand gently through damp sable fur. Arthritis had stiffened the dog's hips badly. Claire had given medication earlier that afternoon along with instructions Ethan folded carefully into the glove box like sacred paper. Funny. A month ago he barely cared whether he remembered to eat. Now he found himself checking medication times for a dog who had once saved his life overseas. Somewhere deep inside, broken pieces had started reconnecting without asking permission. Ethan leaned back against the windscreen and closed his eyes briefly. The memories came easier tonight. Not all painful. Some almost warm. Kandahar. Dust storms turning sunsets blood red over camp fences. Soldiers crowded around cheap speakers, playing old Australian rock while Rex wandered between them accepting scratches from tired hands. Young soldiers barely out of school pretending they were not scared before patrols. Rex always knew. Dogs like him smelled fear before humans admitted it existed. Yet somehow the shepherd carried calm into every room he entered. Ethan remembered one particular night after a rough operation near the mountains. He had sat alone outside the barracks, unable to stop shaking from adrenaline and exhaustion while everyone else tried sleeping. Rex quietly crossed the compound and rested his head against Ethan's knee without command. No barking, no movement, just silent understanding beneath desert stars. Ethan never forgot that moment because no human had noticed he was falling apart until the dog did. A branch cracked softly nearby, pulling him back to the present. Rex had risen suddenly near the edge of the reserve, body stiffening toward the dark bushland beyond the picnic shelter. Ethan sat upright immediately. Old instincts returned before thought did. The shepherd was not aggressive, just alert, focused. Wind shifted through the trees carrying new smells across the reserve. Smoke. Faint. Woodfire maybe. Then another scent reached Ethan seconds later. Petrol. His stomach tightened. He stood slowly beside the Uta. Beyond the reserve, roughly 200 meters uphill near the old service road, a weak orange glow flickered through the trees. Fire. Small for now. Probably careless campers or teenagers. But the bush remained dangerously damp from rain in some places and bone dry beneath thick eucalyptus in others. One gust in the wrong direction could change everything fast. Rex glanced back at Ethan once. Waiting. The exact same battlefield communication they once shared overseas. Ethan grabbed the torch from behind the seat automatically. Come on, mate. They moved uphill together through wet grass and fallen branches while cold wind swept harder across the reserve. The orange glow strengthened between the trees ahead now. Smoke drifted low through the bush, carrying the bitter scent of burning plastic. Ethan's boots slipped slightly on muddy ground as Rex trotted ahead, despite the limp in his back leg. Then suddenly the shepherd stopped dead near the service track. Ears forward, body rigid. Ethan froze beside him. A utility vehicle sat crooked near the roadside 30 meters ahead, with one front wheel half sunk into a drainage ditch. No movement inside. The small fire burned nearby beside scattered camping gear, flames licking dangerously close to dry scrub. Ethan moved cautiously toward the vehicle. Hello. No answer. Rex suddenly broke formation and veered hard right into thick brush beside the road. Ethan heard it half a second later. A faint cry. Human. His pulse surged. Rex. Branches snapped softly as Ethan followed the dog through dense wet scrub until the torch beam finally caught movement beneath a fallen gum limb. A teenage boy, maybe 16, lay trapped awkwardly against muddy ground with one leg pinned beneath heavy timber. His face looked pale beneath streaks of dirt and rainwater. Fear filled his eyes instantly at seeing Ethan emerge from the darkness. Easy, Ethan said quickly, crouching beside him. You hurt bad. The boy shook his head shakily. I slipped. Tried putting the fire out. Rex stood beside them, breathing hard. Amber eyes fixed carefully on the teenager as though refusing to let panic spread further. Ethan examined the fallen limb quickly. Heavy, but manageable. Listen to me, he said calmly. I need you to stay still while I lift this. The boy nodded weakly. Ethan planted both boots into wet earth and strained upward against the soaked timber. Pain flared through his shoulders immediately, old injuries screaming from years long buried. But the branch shifted enough. Rex moved closer instantly, almost guiding the boy backward once his leg came free. The teenager gasped but managed to crawl clear. Ethan exhaled heavily, chest burning from effort. For several seconds, the only sounds were whined through eucalyptus leaves and the distant crackle of the small fire near the road. Then the boy looked directly at Rex. Your dog found me, he whispered. Ethan glanced down at the old shepherd standing quietly beneath drifting smoke and moonlight. Mud clung to his paws, gray fur stirred in the wind. Yet, those amber eyes remained steady as ever. Watching, guarding, saving people like it was still his purpose on earth. Ethan felt emotion tighten painfully behind his ribs again. Some souls never stopped serving others, even after the world forgot them. And standing there beneath cold Australian stars, Ethan realized something with absolute certainty. Rex had not returned to him by accident. The old dog had come back because somewhere deep inside, both of them still needed saving. The boy's name was Liam Harper, 16 years old, soaked through to the skin and shivering beneath the weak glow of Ethan's torch while smoke drifted between the gum trees overhead. Up close he looked younger than 16. Freckles across his cheeks. Mud streaked over a Newcastle Knights hoodie far too thin for the cold. Fear still lingered in his eyes, but it had softened now into shock more than panic. Rex remained beside him the entire time, standing quietly close enough that the boy occasionally reached trembling fingers toward the shepherd's fur like he needed reassurance something solid still existed. Ethan crouched near the small fire by the roadside and stamped dirt over the remaining flames until only smoke and wet ash remained. The smell of burnt eucalyptus hung heavily in the damp night air. You here alone? Ethan asked once the danger had passed. Liam nodded weakly. Me and two mates came up from Belmont. He looked embarrassed suddenly. They bolted after the Uta slid. Ethan glanced toward the tilted utility vehicle resting half in the drainage ditch. Young blokes making bad decisions on wet roads. Australia had buried too many boys that way already. Phone work? Ethan asked. Liam shook his head. Flat battery. Ethan sighed quietly through his nose and looked toward Rex, who still had not relaxed completely. The old K9 kept scanning the dark tree line every few seconds, ears twitching toward distant sounds invisible to human senses. Working dogs never truly switched off. Even now. Especially now. Lucky he found you, Ethan murmured. Liam looked down at Rex with awe still lingering across his face. He came straight through the bush at me. The boy swallowed hard. I thought I was done for out here. Ethan understood that feeling more than he liked admitting. Some nights life pinned people down so quietly they stopped believing rescue existed at all. Yet somehow this old shepherd kept dragging lost souls back toward the light. They helped Liam into the Hilux once the teenager could stand properly again. Rex jumped into the back seat this time, positioning himself directly behind the boy with calm protective focus, while Ethan turned the heater on full blast. Warm air slowly filled the cab alongside the smell of wet dog fur, smoke, and takeaway coffee gone cold hours ago. Liam glanced nervously toward Rex once while buckling himself in. He military? Ethan nodded while starting the engine. Used to be. Explosives dog? Ethan looked briefly at the shepherd in the rearview mirror. Rex sat upright despite exhaustion, watching the road behind them through rain-speckled glass like he still expected convoy trouble at any second. More than that, Ethan answered quietly. The drive toward Swansea passed mostly in silence. Wet roads reflected silver beneath scattered moonlight, while radio stations drifted in and out through static depending on the hills around the lake. Liam eventually spoke again, without looking up. My dad was Army. Ethan waited. Was? The boy shrugged toward the window. Left when I was 10. The words carried forced indifference, but Ethan heard the wound beneath them instantly. Rex shifted slightly behind the boy at the sound of his voice. Liam reached back unconsciously and rested a hand against the shepherd's chest. Rex allowed it. Another small miracle. Most retired military dogs did not trust strangers easily after years of specialized handling. But somehow Rex seemed to understand damaged people differently than everyone else. They dropped Liam safely outside a weatherboard house near the foreshore just after midnight. Porch lights flicked on the moment the Hilux pulled into the driveway. A woman rushed outside wearing slippers and an oversized cardigan, her face pale with fear until she saw her son climb carefully from the Uda. Liam. She wrapped both arms around him instantly while relief broke across her features so strongly Ethan had to look away for a second. Some reunions hurt beautifully when you had lost your own. The woman looked toward Ethan moments later with tears still shining in her eyes. Thank you, she whispered. Police said crews were delayed by the storm and the blocked service road. Ethan shook his head lightly. Thank him. He nodded toward Rex inside the Uda. Liam turned immediately and walked back toward the open window. The old shepherd lifted his head calmly while the teenager scratched gently behind his ears. Good dog, Liam whispered with genuine emotion cracking his voice. Rex blinked slowly beneath the porch light, accepting the praise without movement, like honor itself no longer surprised him. Ethan drove away afterward beneath clearing skies while the town lights shimmered softly across the dark lake beside the road. Midnight had passed now, the world quieter, gentler somehow. He glanced toward Rex resting in the back seat and noticed the old dog breathing heavier than earlier. The limp had worsened too after climbing through bushland. Ethan's chest tightened with concern. You overdid it tonight, mate. Rex opened one eye briefly before settling again. The Hilux eventually rolled into a gravel lookout near Caves Beach, where the ocean spread black and endless beneath moonlight. Ethan parked facing the cliffs and stepped outside into cold sea wind carrying the roar of distant surf below. He needed air. Needed silence. Rex climbed down carefully and stood beside him near the railing overlooking the Pacific. White foam crashed against dark rocks nearly 30 meters below, while stars slowly emerged through thinning clouds overhead. Ethan rested both hands against the cold rail and stared out toward the horizon. You know, he said softly after a while. Emma used to reckon you understood people better than I did. Rex stood quietly beside him. Wind stirred silver through the fur around his muzzle. Ethan smiled faintly at the memory. She would have loved seeing you again. The words hurt, but not the same way anymore. Grief had once felt like drowning beneath cold black water. Tonight it felt more like standing in rain. After years underground. Painful still, yet breathable. Rex slowly leaned his weight against Ethan's leg. Not enough to unbalance him, just enough to remind him he was there. Ethan looked down at the old shepherd, and something inside his chest gave way quietly. Not collapse. Release. He crouched beside Rex and wrapped both arms around the dog's neck, while freezing sea wind roared against the cliffs below them. For several long seconds neither moved. Man and dog beneath Australian stars carrying years of silence between them. Then Ethan whispered something he had not said aloud in a very long time. I do not want to disappear anymore. Rex pressed closer at once, as though somewhere deep inside his loyal old heart, he had been waiting years to hear those exact words. The next morning arrived wrapped in sea fog, so thick it blurred the coastline into pale ghosts beyond the cliffs. Ethan woke inside the Hilux just after sunrise to the sound of gulls circling overhead and the steady rhythm of waves striking rock below Caves Beach. For a few quiet seconds, he simply lay there staring through the fogged windscreen, while cold morning light crept across the dashboard. Then he noticed Rex already awake beside the vehicle. The old shepherd sat facing the ocean completely still, ears tilted toward the wind as though listening to something carried across the water itself. Ethan climbed out slowly, pulling his jacket tighter against the cold. The smell of salt and damp sandstone filled the air. You always did wake before me, he murmured. Rex glanced back immediately, tail brushing softly through wet grass. The stiffness in his hips looked worse this morning. Rising took longer now, more careful. Yet once standing, the old K9 still carried himself with that same quiet dignity Ethan remembered from deployment. Some things age could not steal. Ethan crouched beside him near the cliff path and rubbed warmth into the thick fur around his neck. You saved another kid last night, he said softly. Do not reckon retirement suits you much. Rex leaned lightly into the touch, while sea wine stirred through silvered fur. Ethan smiled faintly before opening the back tray of the Hilux and digging through old camping gear. Buried beneath ropes and fishing tackle sat a faded green thermos Emma bought years ago before a trip through the snowy mountains. Ethan paused when he saw it. Strange how grief lived inside ordinary objects. Coffee mugs, old jumpers, road maps folded by hands that no longer existed. He poured hot water slowly into 2 cups of instant coffee while Rex waited nearby, watching every movement. You know, Ethan said quietly, she used to sneak you bacon when she thought I was not looking. The memory warmed him unexpectedly instead of hurting. Emma standing barefoot in the kitchen, laughing while Rex sat perfectly still pretending innocence despite bacon grease all over his muzzle. Little moments. Those were the things people missed most after loss. Not the big milestones. The tiny ordinary kindnesses. Ethan handed Rex a piece of toast from the last loaf he had left. The old dog accepted it gently as always. No snapping. No urgency. Pure trust. The morning remained still around them until the sound of tires crunching over gravel drifted through the fog. Ethan looked up sharply out of habit. A dark blue council utility vehicle emerged near the lookout carrying the Lake Macquarie City Council logo across the side. Rex noticed it instantly too. His ears rose while his body subtly shifted into alert posture. Working instincts again. The vehicle parked nearby and a stocky man in his 50s stepped out carrying a clipboard beneath one arm. Thick gray beard. Sun-weathered face. Local bloke by the look of him. He glanced toward Ethan and Rex before nodding politely. Morning. Morning, Ethan answered carefully. The man eyed the Hilux for a moment. You sleeping here? Ethan stiffened slightly. Old embarrassment rising automatically. Before he could answer, the man noticed Rex beside him. His expression changed immediately. Well, I will be damned. He crouched slightly toward the shepherd. Military dog. Ethan nodded once. Used to be. The man whistled softly under his breath. My brother handled K9 units over in Darwin years back. Dogs like this, smartest creatures God ever made. Rex watched him calmly but stayed close against Ethan's leg. The man extended a weathered hand. Name is Mick Donnelly. Council Ranger. Ethan shook it carefully. Mick glanced toward the Hilux again, then toward Ethan's tired face with the kind of quiet, understanding older Australians carried without needing many words. Look, mate, he said gently. Officially, I am supposed to move overnight campers along after sunrise. Ethan nodded immediately. Yeah, right. We will head off. But Mick scratched thoughtfully at his beard before continuing. There is an old caretaker cabin up near Blacksmith's Beach Council keeps for emergency stays. Roof leaks a bit. No electricity half the time. But it is dry. Ethan blinked in surprise. You serious? Mick shrugged casually. Better than sleeping in a Uda with winter coming. Then he glanced toward Rex again. Besides, any dog willing to drag idiots out of the bush at midnight deserves a decent roof. Ethan stared for a second, unsure what to say. Kindness felt strange after too long without it. Mick scribbled something onto the back of a receipt and handed it over. Gate code. Cabin is about 6 k's north. He paused before climbing back into the utility vehicle. Sometimes life throws old souls back together for a reason, mate. Best not ignore it. Then he drove away through the fog as quietly as he arrived. Ethan looked down at the paper in his hand while cold sea wind tugged at his jacket. Rex nudged gently against his knee. You hearing this? Ethan murmured in disbelief. We might actually have a roof tonight. The old shepherd's tail moved once slowly through the grass. They reached the caretaker cabin near midday after winding through narrow coastal tracks lined with banksia trees and pale sand dunes. The place looked weathered but sturdy. Small timber structure. Corrugated roof patched in places. A faded veranda facing the ocean. Nothing fancy. Yet when Ethan unlocked the gate and stepped inside, Something loosened deep inside his chest. It smelled of old wood, salt air, and dust untouched by crowds or noise. Home did not always need to be beautiful. Sometimes it just needed to feel safe. Rex walked through the cabin slowly, inspecting each room with careful focus while sunlight filtered through lace curtains faded by years of coastal wind. Ethan watched him. Every few steps the old dog glanced back, as though making sure Ethan still followed. "Clear enough for you?" Ethan asked. Rex finally settled near the front window overlooking the dunes and exhaled heavily onto the timber floorboards. Peace. Real peace. Ethan sat beside him beneath the afternoon light while distant surf rolled beyond the dunes. No traffic. No sirens. No memories pressing quite so hard against his ribs. Just wind and waves and an old dog breathing beside him. After a while, Ethan leaned back against the wall and looked toward the ocean through dusty glass. "Maybe we both needed somewhere to stop running," he whispered. Rex rested his head gently across Ethan's boot in answer. And outside, beneath pale Australian winter skies, the sea kept moving steadily toward shore like grace, arriving one quiet wave at a time. The first real night inside the caretaker cabin felt unfamiliar in the gentlest possible way. Wind moved through the dunes outside, while moonlight spilled pale silver across the timber floorboards and old lace curtains drifted with every breath of sea air. Ethan sat alone at the small kitchen table long after midnight with a battery lantern glowing beside him and Rex asleep near the front window facing the ocean. The cabin creaked occasionally with the sound of settling wood, but unlike the city, the silence here did not feel empty. It felt alive, safe, the sort of silence that let tired souls finally unclench. Ethan wrapped both hands around a chipped enamel mug filled with reheated coffee and stared toward the dog resting nearby. Rex slept deeply now, though even in sleep his ears still twitched toward unfamiliar sounds beyond the dunes. Training lived inside him like instinct carved into bone. One part of Ethan envied that certainty. Dogs never forgot who they were. Humans did all the time. Outside, waves rolled steadily against Blacksmith's Beach while cold winter stars spread across the New South Wales sky. Ethan had almost forgotten stars could look this bright away from city lights. Emma used to drag him outside during camping trips just to sit beneath them in silence. "People are too noisy," she once told him beside a fire near Jindabyne. "The sky fixes that." Back then, Ethan laughed at her for sounding poetic after 2 glasses of cheap red wine. Now, years later, he finally understood what she meant. Grief had made his world smaller, one quiet piece at a time. Smaller rooms, smaller conversations, smaller hopes, until eventually life narrowed into surviving one day after another inside a tired Hilux beside highways full of strangers. Yet somehow this old shepherd had walked back into his life and reopened windows Ethan thought were sealed forever. A soft thump against the floor pulled him from his thoughts. Rex was awake now, lifting his head slowly toward the front door. Ethan listened carefully. Nothing at first except surf and wind. Then faintly beneath it came another sound. Footsteps across sand. Human footsteps. Rex stood carefully despite the stiffness in his hips and moved toward the door with calm alertness. Not aggression. Awareness. Ethan rose and glanced through the front window. A figure approached slowly through moonlit dunes carrying a torch low against the ground. Ethan opened the door cautiously. The cold hit immediately, carrying salt and wet grass through the cabin. "Sorry to bother you this late," a woman's voice called from the darkness. "Mick said someone might be staying here." She stepped into the lantern glow moments later. Mid-30s perhaps. Long auburn hair tucked beneath a wool beanie. Navy rain jacket dusted with sand. Tired green eyes that looked familiar somehow in the way kind people often did. Rex watched her carefully but remained calm. The woman noticed him immediately and softened. "Well, hello there," she whispered. Rex tilted his head slightly but did not move away. Ethan relaxed a fraction. Dogs like Rex trusted slowly. "Can I help you?" he asked. The woman lifted a canvas bag awkwardly. "I run the cafe near the surf club. Mick told me about the dog finding that boy last night." She looked embarrassed suddenly. "I just thought you might need proper food." Ethan blinked in surprise. "You did not have to do that." "I know." A faint smile touched her face. "Still, did." Her name was Claire Bennett. Widow. Former nurse. Owned a tiny beachfront cafe inherited from her parents after years working emergency care in Sydney hospitals. Ethan learned most of this slowly over hot pumpkin soup and fresh bread, while Rex rested near the fireplace, watching both of them. Claire spoke with the calm patience of someone who had witnessed enough suffering to stop pretending life could be controlled. Ethan recognized that immediately. Some pain changed people permanently. Not colder exactly, just gentler around broken things. Mick says your dog found that teenager before anyone else could, Claire said while pouring tea into mismatched mugs. Ethan glanced toward Rex. He always was good at finding people. Claire studied the old shepherd for a long moment. Military. Yeah. Ethan hesitated briefly. Afghanistan. Her expression shifted with quiet understanding. My husband served in the Royal Australian Air Force. Ethan noticed the way she said husband. Present tense gone soft with grief. Lost him. Claire nodded once while staring into her tea. Bushfire response helicopter. 3 years ago. Silence settled naturally between them after that. Not awkward. Honest. Outside, the surf rolled endlessly beneath moonlight, while the cabin warmed slowly from the old fireplace crackling in the corner. Rex eventually rose and crossed the room toward Claire with careful measured steps. Ethan watched in surprise. The old shepherd rarely approached strangers first. Claire stayed perfectly still as Rex lowered his head beside her chair. Then gently, almost reverently, he rested his muzzle against her knee. Claire froze. Her hand trembled slightly before brushing through the fur around his ears. Tears filled her eyes immediately, though she smiled through them. He knows, she whispered. Ethan felt something shift inside the room at those words. Rex closed his eyes briefly beneath her touch like a soul recognizing another wounded soul without explanation. Claire laughed through tears and scratched beneath his collar. You beautiful old thing. Ethan looked toward the ocean through the window while emotion tightened unexpectedly behind his ribs. It struck him suddenly that maybe healing did not arrive all at once like movies promised. Maybe it came instead. A roof during winter. Warm soup from strangers. A dog resting his head against grieving hands. Small mercies. Little lights scattered through darkness, just enough to help people keep walking. Later, after Claire finally left beneath the stars, Ethan stood outside the cabin watching her torch disappear along the dunes toward town. Rex remained beside him breathing slow clouds into the cold air. You approved of her pretty quickly, Ethan murmured. Rex glanced up calmly, tail brushing once against the sand. Ethan chuckled for the first time that night. Real laughter again. Soft. Rusted from disuse. But alive. Wind rolled across Blacksmith's Beach carrying the scent of salt and distant rain, while moonlight silvered the old shepherd's fur beside him. Ethan rested one hand gently against Rex's neck and stared toward the endless Pacific beyond the dunes. Somewhere deep beneath years of grief and exhaustion, hope had begun breathing again. Fragile still, careful, but real enough to feel. Rain returned 3 days later, softer this time, drifting across Blacksmith's Beach in silver sheets that blurred the horizon and filled the dunes with the smell of wet saltgrass and eucalyptus. Ethan stood beneath the veranda roof, watching the weather roll over the Pacific while Rex slept near the doorway wrapped in an old wool blanket Claire had brought from the cafe. The old shepherd's breathing sounded deeper lately. Slower too. Age pressed harder during cold weather. Ethan noticed every small change now. The way Rex rose carefully after resting. The stiffness through his back hips during morning walks. The tiredness settling behind amber eyes that once scanned entire battlefields without blinking. Yet somehow none of it weakened the quiet strength still living inside him. If anything, it made Ethan respect the dog even more. Some souls carried pain without becoming bitter. Claire arrived just after midday balancing 2 takeaway containers beneath her rain jacket while wind tugged strands of auburn hair loose around her face. Rex lifted his head the moment he heard her. Footsteps on the veranda. Ethan smiled faintly. You spoil him too much. Claire crouched immediately beside the shepherd and scratched gently behind his ears. He deserves it. Rex closed his eyes beneath her touch with complete trust now. Watching that still surprised Ethan. The old K9 had spent years guarded around strangers, but somehow Claire moved through his defenses, like someone carrying grief recognized by another grieving soul. They ate lunch together at the small kitchen table while rain tapped steadily against the cabin windows. Pumpkin soup again. Fresh damper bread. Claire always cooked like feeding people mattered deeply to her. Ethan had almost forgotten what that felt like. Mick told me the council might stop temporary stays here by spring, Claire said while stirring tea. Ethan nodded once. Not exactly shocked. Where will you go? The question hung heavily between them. Ethan stared toward the rain beyond the window before answering. Had not really thought that far ahead, which was partly true. Before Rex returned, Ethan barely planned beyond the next tank of fuel. Survival had become smaller than living. Hannah studied him over the rim of her mug. You know the surf club has maintenance work going, she said after a moment. Roof repairs, painting, general upkeep. Ethan gave a tired laugh. You trying to hire a washed-up bloke living in a caretaker shack? I'm trying to hire someone who still shows up when people need help. Her voice stayed gentle but steady. Not everyone does. Ethan looked down at his hands resting against the table. Scarred knuckles, faded tattoos, hands that once knew exactly who they belonged to. Rex shifted slightly near the fireplace, drawing Ethan's eyes toward him. The old shepherd watched quietly from his blanket as though listening to every word. Claire followed Ethan's gaze and smiled softly. He still believes in you, you know. Ethan swallowed against the tightness suddenly rising in his throat. Funny how dangerous kindness could feel when someone had spent years expecting nothing from life except loss. The rain eased toward evening, leaving the dunes wrapped in silver mist beneath darkening skies. Claire eventually returned to town while Ethan and Rex walked slowly along the shoreline after sunset. The beach stretched almost empty beneath the wind, just scattered gulls and distant fishing lights trembling offshore. Rex limped more noticeably tonight, but refused to stay behind at the cabin. Some habits ran deeper than pain. Ethan kept pace beside him carefully. You do not have to keep proving yourself, mate, he murmured. Rex glanced up briefly, ears twitching against the wind. Then he continued walking. Ethan smiled sadly. Yeah, I know. Neither do I. They reached a stretch of black volcanic rock near the southern cliffs where waves crashed hard against the shoreline below. The tide had risen higher than expected, swallowing parts of the lower walking track beneath swirling white water. Ethan rested against the railing overlooking the surf while Rex sniffed carefully along the path. Somewhere nearby, music drifted faintly through the wind from beach houses further north. Ordinary life continuing. Couples eating dinner. Families watching television. People unaware how close loneliness often stood beside them in silence. Then suddenly Rex froze. Ethan noticed the change instantly. The shepherd's posture stiffened hard toward the cliffs below. Ears forward. Eyes fixed. Ethan's pulse quickened. What is it? Rex moved without hesitation down the wet track, leading closer toward the rocks despite the limp in his hips. Ethan followed immediately, boots slipping slightly on rain-slick stone. Wind roared harder near the surf now, carrying cold salt spray through the dark. Rex, the old K9 stopped near the edge of the lower path and barked once sharply toward the rocks below. Not aggression. Alert. Ethan looked down. A figure sat motionless against the cliff wall, barely visible beneath shadows and sea mist. Young woman. Hoodie soaked through. Arms wrapped around herself while waves crashed dangerously close across the rocks nearby. Ethan moved carefully down toward her while Rex remained above watching every movement. Hey, Ethan called gently over the surf. You all right? The woman startled hard, eyes red from crying. Could not have been older than 20. I am fine, she muttered automatically. Ethan recognized that tone instantly. People saying fine when they were anything but. He stopped several meters away, giving her space. Cold place to sit alone. The young woman looked toward the dark ocean without answering. Wind whipped her hair across her face while another wave exploded against the rocks below. Ethan stayed quiet for a moment. Sometimes silence opened doors words could not. Above them, Rex remained perfectly still against the railing, amber eyes never leaving the woman for a second. Guardian watching over strangers again. Finally, the woman whispered something almost lost beneath the wind. I did not think anyone would notice me here. Ethan felt those words land deep inside his chest, because once upon a time he believed the exact same thing. He looked back toward Rex, standing against the storm-dark sky above them. Old, aching, faithful beyond explanation. The shepherd had crossed years and roads and rainstorms because somewhere deep inside, he refused to let Ethan disappear quietly into the dark. Ethan looked gently toward the young woman again. Sometimes, he said softly, one soul noticing you is enough to keep going. Above them, Rex barked once more into the cold night air, while waves crashed endlessly against the Australian shore below, sounding almost like the ocean itself refusing to let another broken heart drift away unnoticed. The young woman's name was Ava Collins, 21 years old, university student from Newcastle. Though she spoke those details quietly, like someone uncertain, they still belonged to her. Rain drifted sideways across the cliffs while Ethan stood nearby with hands buried deep inside his jacket pockets, and Rex remained above them on the path, watching over both like a silent sentry against the storm. Ava kept staring toward the ocean as waves crashed white against the rocks below. "I come here when things get too loud," she admitted finally. "Feels easier near the water." Ethan nodded slowly. He understood that better than most people ever would. Grief, shame, loneliness, fear. They all sounded quieter beside oceans somehow. "You want me to leave?" he asked gently. Ava shook her head after a long silence. "No, one simple word. Honest. Fragile." The wind picked up harder around them, carrying cold salt spray through the darkness. Ethan glanced upward toward Rex. The old shepherd still had not relaxed. Amber eyes fixed carefully on Ava like he sensed pain humans could not always smell in time. Ethan looked back toward her. "My dog found you before I did." Ava finally glanced upward toward Rex, standing against the rail above them. Even through rain and darkness, the shepherd carried something steady about him. "Safe. He is beautiful," she whispered. Ethan smiled faintly. "He is stubborn." For the first time that night, Ava almost smiled too. Barely there, but enough. Ethan slowly sat down on the wet stones several feet away, close enough to stay present without crowding her. The cold soaked through his jeans immediately. He did not care. Some conversations needed patience more than solutions. They stayed there listening to the surf for a while before Ava finally spoke again. "I failed another exam yesterday." Ethan remained quiet. "Mom says I am wasting my life. My boyfriend left 3 weeks ago. Rent keeps going up. Everyone else seems to know where they are going except me." Her voice cracked softly beneath the wind. "I just got tired." Ethan stared toward the black horizon while those words settled heavily between them. Tired. Such a small word for something that could hollow people out completely. "I used to think soldiers came home stronger," Ava whispered after a moment, glancing toward Ethan's faded military tattoo. "But you look sad too." Ethan laughed quietly through his nose. Not offended, just honest. "Yeah," he admitted. "Sometimes surviving and healing are two different things." Above them, Rex shifted slightly and descended the wet track with careful steps despite the pain in his hips. Ava watched him approach slowly through the rain until the old shepherd stopped directly beside her without hesitation. Then, just like he had done with Claire, Rex gently rested his head against her shoulder. Ava froze instantly. Tears filled her eyes before she could stop them. "Why does he keep doing that?" she whispered. Ethan swallowed, against the emotion tightening in his own chest. "Because he knows." Ava broke then, quietly. No dramatic collapse. Just years of pressure finally leaking through tears while storm wind roared around the cliffs. Rex stayed beside her the entire time, without movement, steady as stone beneath her trembling hands. Ethan looked away respectfully toward the ocean. Some grief deserved privacy even when shared. Eventually, Ava wiped her face and laughed weakly through tears. "I probably look ridiculous." "No," Ethan answered softly. "You look human." Rain softened after a while, leaving mist drifting low across the rocks and dunes. Ava finally stood beside Ethan near the path, while Rex climbed slowly ahead of them toward the lookout. The old dog limped more heavily now after too long in the cold. Ethan noticed immediately. "Easy, mate." Ava glanced toward Rex with concern. "Is he all right?" Ethan nodded, though uncertainty tightened quietly inside him. "Getting old." The words hurt more than expected. They walked Ava back toward the car park where her small hatchback sat alone beneath flickering streetlights. Before leaving, she crouched beside Rex one last time and wrapped both arms carefully around his neck. The shepherd accepted the embrace with patient stillness, eyes half closed against the rain. "Thank you," Ava whispered into his fur. Ethan watched quietly from beside the Hilux. Strange. 3 different broken souls in less than a week, and somehow Rex had reached each one without words. Just presence, loyalty, calm. Maybe some creatures carried pieces of grace too large for language. Ava eventually looked toward Ethan while wiping rain from her cheeks. You saved me tonight. Ethan shook his head gently. No, he glanced toward Rex, standing beside him beneath the streetlight glow. He did. After she drove away, silence settled once more over the coastline. The storm had nearly passed now. Clouds drifted apart overhead, revealing scattered stars above the Pacific. Ethan crouched beside Rex near the edge of the lookout and rubbed carefully beneath the old shepherd's collar. You are not done helping people yet, are you? Rex leaned tiredly into his hand. His breathing sounded heavier now, more labored after the long walk and cold weather. Ethan's chest tightened with worry. Back at the cabin later that night, Rex refused dinner for the first time since returning. Not entirely, just a few bites before settling heavily onto the blanket near the fireplace. Ethan knelt immediately beside him. Hey. The shepherd lifted his head weakly at the sound of Ethan's voice, tail brushing once against the timber floorboards. Ethan felt fear stir coldly through his stomach. The kind of fear people carried when they finally loved something enough to lose it again. He called Hannah Morgan at the veterinary clinic first thing despite the late hour. She answered groggily, but listened carefully while Ethan described the symptoms. It could just be exhaustion, she said gently over the phone. But at his age, you need to watch him closely tonight. Ethan sat beside Rex long after ending the call, while firelight flickered softly across the cabin walls. Outside, waves rolled steadily through darkness beyond the dunes. The old shepherd rested his head across Ethan's boot exactly like he used to after patrols overseas. Familiar, comforting, fragile. Ethan looked down at the gray fur silvered by firelight and suddenly understood something terrifying. Rex had not only come back to save him. He had come back because time was running out. Ethan bowed his head slowly and rested one hand against the shepherd's neck while emotion tightened painfully behind his ribs. Please stay a while longer, mate, he whispered into the quiet cabin. Rex opened his tired amber eyes at the sound of his voice and gently pressed closer against him as the fire crackled softly through the cold Australian night. The cabin stayed quiet through the rest of the night except for the crackling fireplace and the steady rise and fall of Rex's breathing beside it. Ethan barely slept. Every time the old shepherd shifted or exhaled too sharply, Ethan's eyes opened instantly in the darkness. Fear changed people like that. Once you knew what it meant to lose something irreplaceable, your heart never fully relaxed again. Just before dawn, pale blue light began filtering through the lace curtains while cold sea wind rattled softly against the windows. Ethan sat cross-legged beside Rex on the floorboards with a blanket around his shoulders and one hand resting gently against the dog's chest. Warm, still breathing. Thank God. Rex opened his eyes slowly at the touch and looked directly at Ethan with that same calm loyalty he had carried through war zones, storms, shelters, and lonely roads. Ethan smiled faintly despite the exhaustion burning behind his eyes. Morning, mate. The old shepherd's tail brushed softly once against the timber floor. Outside, the world slowly woke beyond the dunes. Distant gulls, surf rolling steady toward shore. The faint rumble of early fishing boats crossing the lake. Ordinary sounds. Beautiful sounds. Ethan had spent too many years disconnected from mornings to realize how sacred ordinary life actually was. He heated water over the small gas stove and prepared medication Hannah Morgan prescribed earlier in the week. Rex accepted it carefully from his hand before resting again near the fireplace. Ethan noticed the dog's appetite returning slightly, which eased some of the fear twisting inside his chest. Maybe exhaustion truly had caught up with him after the rescue at the cliffs. Or maybe old souls simply needed reminding they were not carrying the world alone anymore. Around mid-morning, tires crunched over gravel outside the cabin. Rex lifted his head immediately despite his fatigue, ears twitching toward the sound. Ethan opened the front door to find Claire Bennett stepping from her old Land Cruiser, carrying a cardboard box against her hip. Sea wind tugged loose strands of auburn hair around her face, while winter sunlight shimmered softly across the dunes behind her. I brought supplies, she announced gently. And before you argue, half the cafe stock expires tomorrow anyway. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. You always this stubborn? Only around men who forget how to ask for help. Rex approached slowly from inside the cabin, tail moving carefully at the sight of her. Claire crouched immediately despite the cold gravel beneath her knees. "Hello, handsome." The old shepherd pressed his muzzle softly into her palm while she scratched behind his ears with familiar tenderness. Ethan watched the moment quietly from the doorway. Strange how quickly certain people began feeling woven into empty places. Inside the box sat soup containers, fresh bread, dog food, thick blankets, and a small framed photograph Ethan instantly recognized. His breath caught. Emma, standing barefoot beside Lake Jindabyne years ago with Rex sitting proudly beside her beneath snow gums. Ethan stared at the photograph in stunned silence. "Where did you get this?" Claire smiled gently while unpacking supplies onto the kitchen bench. "It fell from behind the seat in your Uda yesterday when Mick helped move some tools." Ethan carefully picked up the frame with trembling hands. Emma's smile looked exactly how he remembered it. Warm, certain, alive. Rex noticed the photograph too. The old shepherd slowly walked closer before resting his head gently against Ethan's knee while staring toward Emma's image. Ethan swallowed hard against the sudden ache filling his chest. "She loved this dog more than she loved most people," he whispered. Claire looked toward the photo quietly. "Looks like he loved her too." Silence settled softly around the cabin after that. Not uncomfortable. Sacred somehow. Ethan lowered himself into a chair beside the fireplace while Rex rested at his feet, and Claire prepared tea near the stove. Sunlight drifted across the timber floorboards in pale gold bands. For the first time in years, Ethan realized the cabin no longer felt temporary. It felt lived in, human, safe. Claire eventually carried 2 mugs to the table and sat opposite him. "You know," she said carefully, "Mick told me the surf club committee wants to meet you." Ethan frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because apparently a retired military dog rescued a teenager from the bush and stopped another girl from hurting herself on the cliffs." She smiled faintly over the rim of her mug. News travels fast in small coastal towns. Ethan rubbed a tired hand over his jaw. Was not exactly trying to become local news. Maybe not. Claire glanced toward Rex, sleeping peacefully near the fireplace now. But sometimes people need reminders that loyalty still exists. Ethan looked toward the old shepherd quietly. Gray fur, scarred shoulders, tired breathing. Yet somehow Rex still carried enough kindness inside him to save strangers without hesitation. The world had abandoned him more than once, yet he returned love anyway. Ethan wondered if humans were meant to learn something from creatures like that. Later that afternoon, rain clouds finally broke apart completely, leaving winter sunlight glowing warm across Blacksmith's Beach. Ethan walked slowly with Rex along the dunes while Claire returned to town for evening service at the cafe. The old shepherd moved carefully now, but happier somehow. Lighter. Children near the surf club waved excitedly when they recognized him from local chatter spreading through town. One little boy asked if Rex was the hero dog. Ethan almost corrected him before glancing down at the shepherd beside him. Rex simply accepted the attention calmly, like he had no idea his presence kept changing lives around him. They stopped near the shoreline where waves rolled gently across wet sand reflecting the late afternoon sun. Ethan sat beside Rex facing the ocean while gulls drifted overhead in lazy circles. "You know something funny?" Ethan murmured after a while. "I spent years thinking I lost everything." Rex rested his head across Ethan's leg without lifting his eyes from the sea. Ethan stared toward the endless horizon glowing gold beneath the setting sun. "Turns out I just lost my way." Wind moved softly through the dunes around them while the old shepherd pressed closer against his side. And there beside the Pacific, beneath fading Australian light and the quiet grace of an ordinary evening, Ethan finally understood what Rex had been trying to teach him all along. Some souls do not return to your life to remind you of pain. They return to lead you home. Winter settled gently over Blacksmith's Beach in the weeks that followed, bringing cold mornings wrapped in sea fog and evenings scented with wood smoke drifting from nearby homes along the coast. The caretaker cabin no longer felt abandoned now. Claire's blankets covered the old couch. Fresh groceries appeared in the kitchen every few days. Mick stopped by occasionally with tools or fishing bait and always pretended he had just been passing through. Even the surf club committee had quietly hired Ethan to repair fencing and repaint storm-damaged storage sheds near the dunes. Nothing glamorous, just honest work beneath open skies. But after years of drifting without direction, Ethan found something sacred in ordinary responsibility again. Each morning Rex followed him down the beach toward the surf club despite the stiffness growing steadily through his hips. Children greeted the old shepherd before they greeted Ethan now. Tourists stopped asking permission to photograph him after hearing local stories from cafe tables and fishing docks. Someone even tied a small blue ribbon around the surf club fence with a handwritten note beneath it. For the dog who still watches over people. Ethan noticed Rex pause beside the ribbon one windy afternoon while gulls wheeled overhead. The old shepherd simply stared at it for a moment before continuing down the sand. No pride, no understanding of fame, just quiet purpose, same as always. Yet beneath those peaceful days, Ethan saw changes others might have missed. Rex tired more quickly now after long walks. Sometimes his back legs trembled slightly after climbing stairs. And on colder nights, the old K9 slept closer to the fireplace than before, breathing slower beneath layers of blankets while ocean wind rattled softly against the cabin walls. Hannah Morgan visited twice weekly to check his condition. Her expression always stayed gentle, but Ethan recognized concern hidden behind professional calm. One rainy evening after examining Rex near the fireplace, she finally looked toward Ethan with tired honesty in her eyes. "He is comfortable," she said softly. "That matters most." Ethan swallowed hard. "How much time?" Claire hesitated. Rain tapped quietly against the cabin windows while Rex rested peacefully between them. "Dogs like him do not measure life the same way we do," she answered carefully. "They measure love, safety, whether their person came back." Ethan looked down at Rex lying across his boots and felt his throat tighten. Painfully. "I wasted years." Claire shook her head gently. "No." She smiled sadly toward the old shepherd. "He waited years." After she left, Ethan sat alone beside the fire long into the night while Rex slept nearby. Outside, storms rolled across the Pacific, carrying distant thunder through the darkness. Ethan stared at Emma's framed photograph resting on the shelf above the fireplace. Her smile still looked impossibly alive in the flickering firelight. "I think he came back to finish something," Ethan whispered quietly toward the photo. Rex opened his eyes immediately at the sound of Ethan's voice and lifted his head slowly from the blanket. Ethan crouched beside him and rubbed carefully beneath his collar. "Maybe he needed to know I would be all right before he could rest." The old shepherd leaned softly into his hand. No fear in those tired amber eyes. Only trust. Complete trust. A few days later, while repairing storm fencing near the dunes, Ethan noticed someone approaching across the sand carrying takeaway coffees. Ava Collins, the young woman from the cliffs. She looked different now, healthier somehow, still fragile around the edges, but present in her own life again. She smiled shyly when Rex recognized her instantly and struggled upright from the sand despite his aching hips. "Easy there, hero," Ava laughed softly while kneeling beside him. Rex rested his head against her shoulder with familiar affection. Ethan accepted the coffee she handed him and raised an eyebrow. "Thought university students were supposed to sleep until noon." Ava rolled her eyes. "Thought old soldiers were supposed to retire." Ethan laughed quietly at that. Real laughter again. The kind Emma used to say sounded younger than his face. Ava glanced toward the ocean while wind swept strands of hair across her cheeks. "I started counseling," she admitted after a moment. "And I reapplied for next semester." Ethan nodded slowly. "That is good." Ava looked down at Rex resting calmly beside her boots. "I still come to the cliffs sometimes." She smiled faintly. "Just not for the same reason anymore." Ethan followed her gaze toward the old shepherd. Funny, Rex had rescued people without dramatic speeches or grand gestures. He simply showed up beside hurting souls and refused to leave them alone in the dark. Perhaps that was what healing really looked like. Not fixing pain completely, just staying long enough to remind someone they mattered. That evening, the entire town gathered quietly near the surf club for a winter fundraiser after recent storm damage along the coastline. Fairy lights glowed softly across the dunes while local musicians played acoustic songs beneath heaters and drifting sea mist. Children chased each other barefoot across cold sand. Couples shared takeaway chips wrapped in paper. Simple coastal life carrying on beneath Australian stars. Ethan stood awkwardly near the back of the crowd with Rex lying beside him wrapped in Claire's wool blanket. He never enjoyed attention much, even before war changed him. But eventually Mick climbed onto the small stage near the surf club deck and cleared his throat loudly enough to silence the gathering. Right then, the ranger announced gruffly, "Before everyone gets properly drunk on mulled wine, there is something this town wants to say." Ethan immediately looked uncomfortable. Claire Bennett smiled knowingly beside him. Mick gestured toward Rex lying quietly beneath the fairy lights. "Most heroes wear uniforms once," he said softly. "Some keep serving long after the world stops noticing." Silence settled gently across the crowd while sea wind stirred through the dunes. Then one by one, people began clapping. Not loud, not dramatic, just sincere. Honest gratitude carried through cold night air. Ethan looked down at Rex, whose tired amber eyes slowly scanned the smiling faces surrounding them. Liam Harper stood near the surf club entranced clapping beside his mother. Ava smiled through tears near the dunes. Claire Bennett rested one hand gently against Ethan's arm, while children whispered excitedly about the guardian dog from the beach. Ethan felt emotion rise so suddenly it almost stole his breath. For years he believed loss had emptied his life beyond repair. Yet here stood an entire community stitched quietly together by one aging German shepherd who refused to stop loving people. Despite everything life had taken from him, Ethan knelt beside Rex beneath the fairy lights and rested his forehead softly against the old shepherd's head while applause drifted around them like ocean waves. "You found your mission again, mate," he whispered brokenly. Rex closed his eyes peacefully beneath the touch as winter stars shimmered above the Australian coast, and somewhere beyond the dunes, the sea kept whispering its ancient reminder into the night. Broken things can still guide others home. Spring arrived slowly along the New South Wales coast, carried in on warmer sea winds and mornings filled with magpie songs drifting through the dunes beyond the caretaker cabin. Wildflowers pushed through the sandy tracks near Blacksmith's Beach, and the ocean lost some of its winter harshness, turning softer shades of blue beneath longer afternoons of sunlight. Life moved differently now. Gently. Ethan noticed it in small things first. The way he no longer woke dreading the morning. The way laughter returned easier around Claire Bennett's cafe. The way the cabin smelled less like loneliness and more like coffee, salt air, and damp dog fur drying beside the fireplace. Yet even as the world brightened around them, Rex grew quieter. The old shepherd still followed Ethan everywhere, though his pace had slowed to careful measured steps along the shoreline. Some mornings he needed help climbing into the hylix. Other days he simply rested beneath the surf club deck, while children sat nearby reading books aloud to him like he was part guardian, part grandfather, part sacred local legend. Nobody rushed him anymore. The whole town seemed to understand somehow. Time with souls like Rex became precious once people recognized what they carried. One mild afternoon, Ethan sat outside the cafe repairing fishing nets for Mick while Rex slept beneath the table beside him. Claire moved between customers carrying plates of fish and chips while gulls circled lazily overhead near the marina. The scene looked ordinary enough from the outside, but Ethan knew how miraculous ordinary peace truly was. A year ago, he had been sleeping in a Udo wondering whether life still held room for him at all. Now people greeted him by name along the foreshore. Teenagers from the surf club stopped to pat Rex on their way to training. Ava occasionally studied at the cafe after university classes and always brought the old shepherd bits of grilled chicken wrapped carefully in napkins. Somewhere along the way, healing stopped feeling impossible. Ethan glanced down at Rex sleeping peacefully beneath the table. Gray fur silvered in the afternoon light. Slow breathing. Tired paws twitching occasionally through dreams only dogs understood. Ethan's chest tightened softly. "You still with me, mate?" Rex opened one eye at the sound of his voice and thumped his tail once against the timber decking. Claire noticed the exchange while wiping down a nearby table. Her expression gentled immediately. Later that evening, after closing the cafe, she found Ethan sitting alone beside the dunes watching sunset burn gold across the Pacific, while Rex rested beside him wrapped in his favorite wool blanket. Claire sat quietly nearby, without speaking at first. The sky looked enormous above them. Endless. "Hannah Morgan called me today," she said carefully after a while. Ethan did not answer immediately. He already knew. Some truths arrived before words. "His heart is getting tired," Claire whispered. Wind moved softly through the dunes around them, while waves rolled toward shore beneath fading light. Ethan lowered his gaze toward Rex and rested one rough hand against the old shepherd's neck. He spent his whole life protecting people. Ethan murmured quietly. Feels wrong not being able to protect him back. Claire leaned gently against his shoulder. You did. Ethan looked toward her. Tears already shone in her eyes too. You gave him somewhere to come home to. The sunset faded slowly after that, leaving the beach wrapped in lavender twilight and distant fishing lights blinking offshore. Rex eventually lifted himself carefully and walked toward the shoreline alone. Ethan followed immediately, concern tightening through his chest. But the old shepherd simply stopped near the water where foam curled softly across wet sand beneath the stars beginning to appear overhead. Then he sat, calm, peaceful, watching the ocean. Ethan lowered himself beside him while cold evening wind carried salt across the beach. Claire remained further back near the dunes, giving them space. For a long while neither man nor dog moved, just breathing together beside the Pacific while the tide whispered across the sand. Ethan thought about Afghanistan, about Emma, about lonely roads and broken years, and the impossible moment outside that servo when Rex stepped back into his life, carrying hope, like something sacred clenched gently between his teeth. You saved me twice, Ethan whispered hoarsely into the dark. Rex slowly rested his head against Ethan's shoulder. The exact same way he used to after dangerous patrols overseas, whenever the world felt too heavy to carry alone. Ethan shut his eyes tightly against the emotion breaking inside his chest. I think I finally understand now, he whispered. You were never trying to lead me back to who I was. His voice cracked softly. You were leading me toward who I still could become. Wind rolled gently across the shoreline, while stars shimmered over the Australian coast. Somewhere nearby, a lighthouse beam swept silently across the ocean like a quiet blessing passing through darkness. Rex breathed slowly against Ethan's shoulder for several long moments more. Then softer, slower, peaceful. Ethan felt it before he fully understood it. The stillness. Not frightening, not painful, just rest. The kind earned by souls who carried love faithfully through every storm life placed before them. Ethan bowed his head against the old shepherd's fur while tears slipped silently down his face into the night air. Good boy, he whispered brokenly. You can rest now. Waves continued rolling toward shore beneath the stars while the world remained beautifully, heartbreakingly quiet around them. No drama, no fear, just an old soldier sitting beside the dog who refused to abandon him, even after the world forgot them both. Claire eventually approached slowly across the sand and knelt beside Ethan without speaking. Together they sat there beneath the endless southern sky, while sea wind moved gently through Rex's silvered fur one final time. Months later, a small wooden sign appeared near the dunes outside the old caretaker cabin, where locals often walked at sunset. Ethan built it himself from driftwood washed ashore after spring storms. Carved carefully into the timber were 7 simple words. Forgotten does not mean unloved. And every evening beneath the fading Australian light, people still noticed one quiet detail beside the sign. A weathered water bowl, always full, beside fresh wildflowers. Because some souls do not vanish when they leave. They keep watch from a little farther down the road.